The September wind carried a chill that spoke of winter coming early to the high mesa country of northern New Mexico. And Dr. Benjamin Wade pulled his coat tighter as he guided his sturdy roan horse along the narrow trail that wound between towering red rock formations. The medical bag secured behind his saddle contained everything he owned in the world, a collection of instruments, medicines, and bandages that represented 15 years of practicing frontier medicine in some of the most remote and dangerous territory in the American West. At 42, Ben had seen enough suffering to fill several lifetimes. He'd treated gunshot wounds in saloon back rooms, delivered babies in sod houses during blizzards, and amputated limbs by lamplight, while hostile Indians circled outside. But what drove him wasn't the money. There wasn't much of that in frontier doctoring or the glory, which was non-existent. What kept him riding from settlement to settlement was the simple knowledge that he was often the only thing standing between the sick and death in a land where medical help was measured in hundreds of miles rather than city blocks. His current destination was the small ranching community of Mesa Blanca, where a telegram had reached him reporting an outbreak of some kind of fever that was spreading through the local population. The symptoms described in the hastily scrawled message, high fever, severe headaches, and a distinctive rash, suggested typhus, a disease that could wipe out an entire settlement if not treated quickly and properly. But as Ben crested a low rise and saw the valley spread out below him, he realized that Mesa Blanca's problems were more complex than a simple disease outbreak. Scattered across the grassland were the temporary shelters and cooking fires of what appeared to be a large Apache encampment, positioned strategically around the town like the pieces of some vast military operation. Ben's blood ran cold as he took in the scene. Apache war parties had been increasingly active in recent months, raiding isolated ranches and attacking supply wagons with a ferocity that suggested something more than the usual conflicts over territory and resources. The presence of such a large native force so close to a white settlement could only mean one thing: Mesa Blanca was under siege. He was about to turn back and find another route to safety when his sharp eyes caught something that made him pause. The Apache camp showed none of the usual signs of a war party preparing for battle. There were no warriors painted for combat, no weapons being readied, no horses being prepared for rapid movement. Instead, what he saw looked more like a peaceful encampment, with women and children visible among the shelters and cooking fires burning steadily as if the people planned to stay for some time. More puzzling still was the fact that he could see movement between the Apache camp and the town itself, small groups of people walking back and forth as if some kind of communication or cooperation was taking place. In his years of frontier experience, Ben had never seen anything like it. Curiosity overcoming caution, Ben rode slowly down into the valley, his medical training making him acutely aware of every detail he observed. As he drew closer to the town, he could see that many of the buildings showed signs of damage, not the kind of destruction that came from an attack, but the neglect and deterioration that suggested a community struggling with some kind of ongoing crisis. A young Apache woman emerged from one of the houses on the edge of town, carrying a wooden bucket that steamed in the cool air. She looked up at Ben's approach with intelligent dark eyes that showed no fear, only a careful assessment of this newcomer and his potential intentions. "You are doctor?" she asked in careful English, nodding toward the medical bag visible on his horse. "Town people. They send word for doctor to come." Ben nodded, still trying to process the surreal scene of an Apache woman apparently serving as a messenger for the white settlement. "Yes, I'm Dr. Wade. I received a telegram about a fever outbreak." The woman's expression grew grave. "Much sickness in town. Apache help, but white medicine needed too. You come? Help all people?" The question carried a weight that Ben was only beginning to understand. Somehow, in this remote valley, Apache and white settlers had found a way to work together in the face of a medical crisis that threatened both communities. It was unprecedented in his experience, and it suggested possibilities that challenged everything he thought he knew about frontier relations. "Take me to the sick," Ben said simply. What Ben discovered in Mesa Blanca was unlike anything in his medical experience. The fever that had struck the community was indeed typhus, but it wasn't confined to the white population. It had spread to the Apache camp as well, creating a crisis that threatened both communities and had forced them into an uneasy but necessary cooperation. The town's only doctor, an elderly physician named Dr. Harrison, had died from the disease 2 weeks earlier, leaving the settlement without medical leadership at the worst possible time. That's when something remarkable had happened. The Apache had offered their help, bringing their own traditional healers and offering to assist with nursing care for the sick. "Never seen anything like it," wheezed Tom Sullivan, the town's mayor, as Ben examined him in the makeshift hospital that had been set up in the old church. Apache showed up the day after Doc Harrison died, said they wanted to help. Figured we didn't have much choice but to accept. The cooperation wasn't without its tensions. Many of the white settlers remained deeply suspicious of Apache motives, while some of the younger Apache warriors clearly chafed at being asked to help their traditional enemies. But the crisis had created a bond of necessity that was gradually growing into something approaching mutual respect. Leading the Apache medical effort was an elderly medicine man named Naalnish, whose knowledge of traditional healing practices complemented Ben's modern medical training in ways that surprised them both. The old Apache had a deep understanding of herbal remedies and healing techniques that had been developed over generations of dealing with disease and injury in harsh frontier conditions. White doctor's medicine stops the fever, Naalnish explained through an interpreter as Ben examined his first Apache patient. Apache medicine makes body strong to fight the sickness. Together, both medicines work better than either alone. Ben found himself working alongside Apache healers who approached medicine from a completely different perspective but shared his fundamental commitment to preserving life and alleviating suffering. It was a collaboration that challenged his preconceptions about primitive medical practices and opened his eyes to the sophistication of traditional Apache healing methods. But it was when Ben was called to examine Naalnish himself that he discovered the true depth of the Apache commitment to their alliance with the white settlement. The old medicine man was seriously ill, weakened by age, and exhausted from his efforts to care for others. Worse, Ben's examination revealed that Naalnish was suffering from something far more serious than typhus. The symptoms suggested a heart condition that could prove fatal without proper treatment. "He's been pushing himself too hard," Ben told the group of Apache leaders who had gathered outside Naalnish's shelter. "His heart is weak, and the stress of caring for so many patients is putting a dangerous strain on his system. He needs rest, proper medication, and careful monitoring." The news was met with grim silence. Naalnish wasn't just a medicine man, he was one of the most respected elders in the Apache community, a leader whose wisdom and spiritual guidance were considered essential to the tribe's well-being. His death would be a devastating loss that could fracture the delicate cooperation that had developed between the two communities. "Can you save him?" asked a young Apache warrior named Taza, whose English was better than most. "White medicine. Can it help where Apache medicine cannot?" Ben studied the faces around him, seeing hope, fear, and a desperate need for honesty rather than false comfort. "I can try," he said finally, "but it will require intensive care, medicines I'll have to send for, and probably weeks of recovery. And even then, there are no guarantees." "What do you need?" Taza asked immediately. "Digitalis for his heart, proper nursing care, and a way to keep him isolated from the stress of the ongoing medical crisis. He needs to focus on his own recovery, not worry about everyone else's problems." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, Apache runners were dispatched to distant trading posts to procure the medicines Ben needed, while others began constructing a special shelter designed to provide the quiet and comfortable environment necessary for Naalnish's recovery. The white settlers, many of whom owed their lives to the old medicine man's care, contributed supplies and labor to the effort. As Ben began the delicate process of treating Naalnish's heart condition, he realized that he was participating in something far more significant than simply caring for one patient. The cooperation between Apache and white communities that had been born out of medical necessity was evolving into something approaching genuine friendship and mutual respect. But the real test was yet to come. As autumn deepened into winter, the typhus outbreak gradually came under control, but Ben found himself facing a new and more complex challenge. Word of the unprecedented cooperation between Apache and white settlers had spread throughout the territory, attracting attention from sources that viewed the alliance with suspicion and hostility. The first warning came from a cavalry patrol that rode into Mesa Blanca on a cold November morning, their leader demanding to know why Apache were being allowed to camp so close to a white settlement. Captain Morrison, a career officer with little tolerance for what he saw as unauthorized fraternization with hostiles, made his displeasure clear from the moment he dismounted. "Dr. Wade, I've received reports of Apache warriors operating freely within this settlement," Morrison said as he confronted Ben outside the improvised hospital. "This is highly irregular and potentially dangerous. These people need to be relocated to the reservation immediately." Ben felt his jaw tighten as he looked at the young officer, recognizing the type of man who saw the world in simple terms of us versus them. with no understanding of the complex realities that frontier communities faced. "Captain, these Apache aren't hostiles. They're medical volunteers who've been helping to save lives. Without their assistance, this entire settlement would probably be dead by now." "That's beside the point," Morrison replied stiffly. "Regulations require that all Apache remain on designated reservation lands unless specifically authorized by territorial authorities. I have orders to escort them back to San Carlos." The confrontation was interrupted by the arrival of Taza, who had been serving as the primary liaison between the Apache and white communities throughout the crisis. The young warrior's English had improved dramatically during the weeks of cooperation, and his diplomatic skills had proven essential to maintaining peace between the two groups. "Captain Morrison," Taza said formally. "Apache people here under protection of sacred law. Medicine man, Naalnish, very sick. Cannot be moved without risk of death. Apache tradition says no one leaves medicine man's side until he recovers or joins ancestors." Morrison's expression showed his frustration with customs and traditions that didn't fit neatly into military regulations. "I understand your concerns, but I have my orders. All Apache must return to the reservation within 48 hours. Ben realized that the moment of crisis he'd been dreading had finally arrived. The fragile alliance between the communities was about to be shattered by bureaucratic inflexibility and military prejudice, destroying weeks of progress and potentially condemning Naalnish to death if he was forced to endure the difficult journey to San Carlos in his weakened condition. "Captain," Ben said carefully, "I'm formally requesting that these Apache be allowed to remain here as medical assistants working under my supervision. As a licensed physician, I have the authority to deputize civilian volunteers during medical emergencies. That authority doesn't extend to unauthorized Apache," Morrison replied. "My orders are clear." The standoff continued for the rest of the day, with Morrison insisting on immediate compliance while Ben and the community leaders searched desperately for some legal loophole that would allow the Apache to remain. The solution came from an unexpected source, Mayor Sullivan, whose recovery from typhus had been aided significantly by Apache nursing care. "Captain," Sullivan said as the town council convened an emergency meeting, "I'm formally requesting territorial protection for these Apache under the Good Samaritan provisions of territorial law. They've provided essential medical services to our community, and forcing them to leave would constitute a violation of their civil rights as volunteer medical workers." It was a legal argument that had never been tested in territorial courts, but it carried enough potential validity to give Morrison pause. The captain was clearly uncomfortable with the idea of taking action that might later be ruled illegal, especially when it involved medical personnel who had saved the lives of American citizens. "I'll need to consult with my superiors," Morrison said finally. "But until I receive new orders, the Apache can remain temporarily." As the cavalry patrol departed to seek guidance from higher authorities, Ben realized that the real battle was just beginning. The attention focused on Mesa Blanca would inevitably bring more scrutiny from territorial officials, military commanders, and politicians who had their own agendas regarding Apache policy. But for the moment, at least, Naalnish was safe to continue his recovery under Ben's care, and the alliance between the communities remained intact. Winter arrived with unusual severity that year, bringing blizzards and bitter cold that isolated Mesa Blanca from the outside world for weeks at a time. But the harsh weather that might have destroyed a less cohesive community only served to strengthen the bonds between Apache and white settlers who had learned to depend on each other for survival. The Apache proved to be invaluable partners in dealing with winter's challenges. Their traditional knowledge of surviving in harsh conditions, where to find shelter from storms, how to preserve food through long cold spells, techniques for keeping livestock alive when feed was scarce, complemented the settlers' agricultural and mechanical skills in ways that benefited everyone. Ben found himself learning as much from his Apache colleagues as he was teaching them. Naalnish, slowly recovering under Ben's careful medical supervision, proved to be a wealth of knowledge about traditional healing practices that could supplement modern medicine when supplies ran low or specific treatments weren't available. "Apache medicine not try to replace white medicine," Naalnish explained during one of their conversations as his strength gradually returned. "But Apache medicine knows things white medicine has not yet learned. Plants that ease pain, techniques that help bones heal stronger, ways to help mind recover from great sickness or injury." The collaboration between traditional and modern medical practices was producing remarkable results. Patients who received both types of treatment seemed to recover faster and more completely than those treated with either approach alone. Ben began keeping detailed notes on the traditional remedies that proved most effective, recognizing that he was documenting medical knowledge that had never been formally recorded. But the real test of the community's unity came in February, when a series of severe storms was followed by the arrival of unwelcome visitors. A group of territorial officials, led by an ambitious politician named Judge Crawford, arrived with orders to investigate the irregular situation that had developed in Mesa Blanca. Crawford was a man with his eye on higher office, and he saw the Apache situation as an opportunity to make political capital by taking a hard line on what he characterized as unauthorized coddling of hostiles. His arrival was accompanied by newspaper reporters eager to document what they assumed would be a scandal involving Apache sympathizers and government officials failing to enforce territorial law. Dr. Wade, Crawford announced as he convened what he called an official territorial inquiry in the town's largest building. You stand accused of harboring Apache hostiles in violation of territorial regulations, providing material support to individuals who should be confined to reservation lands, and undermining the authority of the United States government in its dealings with hostile tribes. The charges were serious enough to result in criminal prosecution if they stuck, but Ben had spent the winter months preparing for exactly this confrontation. With the help of Mayor Sullivan and several community leaders, he had documented every aspect of the Apache medical mission, creating a detailed record of lives saved, services provided, and cooperation achieved. Judge Crawford, Ben replied formally, I stand ready to defend my actions before any legitimate tribunal, but I also stand ready to present evidence that what happened here represents one of the most successful examples of peaceful cooperation between Apache and white communities in territorial history. The inquiry that followed was unlike anything in territorial legal history. Witness after witness testified about Apache medical assistants that had saved their lives or the lives of their family members. Detailed medical records showed the effectiveness of combined traditional and modern treatments. Community leaders spoke about the practical benefits of Apache knowledge in dealing with winter survival challenges, but perhaps the most powerful testimony came from Naalnish himself, now recovered enough to speak on behalf of his people. The old medicine man's dignity and wisdom impressed even Crawford's supporters, while his detailed account of Apache efforts to help the white community challenged every stereotype about savage Indians. Apache people know what it means to suffer, Naalnish said through Taza's translation. We know what it means to lose children to disease, to watch elders die because help does not come in time. When we see other people suffering same way, Apache heart says we must help, regardless of color of skin or language spoken. The inquiry continued for 3 days, with Crawford becoming increasingly frustrated as his attempt to portray the situation as a scandal crumbled under the weight of evidence and testimony. The newspaper reporters, who had come expecting to document government incompetence, found themselves writing about an unprecedented example of successful racial cooperation instead. On the final day of the inquiry, Crawford was forced to announce his findings. While some technical violations of territorial regulations had occurred, they were justified by the medical emergency that had threatened both communities, and the results achieved far outweighed any procedural concerns. But Crawford's departure didn't mark the end of external threats to the Mesa Blanca experiment. Spring brought new challenges in the form of increased Apache raids throughout the territory, not from Naalnish's peaceful band, but from hostile groups who saw the Mesa Blanca cooperation as a betrayal of Apache traditions and white communities as legitimate targets for retaliation. The irony wasn't lost on Ben that the success of peaceful cooperation was actually making life more dangerous for everyone involved. The hostile raids created a political climate that made the Mesa Blanca situation increasingly precarious. Territorial officials were under pressure to take a harder line against all Apache, regardless of their actual behavior, while military commanders argued that allowing any Apache to remain off-reservation sent the wrong message to hostile bands. The crisis came to a head in May, when a particularly brutal raid on a nearby ranch resulted in the deaths of an entire family, including 3 young children. The territorial governor, facing intense pressure from newspapers and political opponents, issued an ultimatum. All Apache in the territory must report to designated reservations within 30 days, or face forcible relocation by military forces. It's not fair, but it's reality, Mayor Sullivan explained to the assembled Apache leaders as they met to discuss their options. The governor's under tremendous pressure to do something about the raids, and unfortunately, that means all Apache are being lumped together regardless of their actual actions. Ben felt sick as he watched the faces of people who had risked their lives to help white settlers, now being told that their loyalty and service meant nothing in the face of political expediency. Naalnish, fully recovered from his heart condition but visibly aged by the stress of recent events, spoke for his people with quiet dignity. "Apache understand white man's fear," the old medicine man said. "But Apache also understand that fear makes people do foolish things. If we go to reservation, cooperation ends, friendship dies, and both peoples lose something valuable." The debate that followed was painful but necessary. Some of the Apache argued for compliance with the governor's order, believing that resistance would only bring more hardship on their families. Others advocated for armed resistance, arguing that they had earned the right to remain through their service to the community. But it was Taza who proposed the solution that would ultimately save the situation. The young Apache warrior had become not just a translator but a genuine diplomat, understanding both cultures well enough to find common ground where others saw only conflict. "What if Apache people don't go to reservation, but also don't stay in Mesa Blanca?" Taza suggested. "What if we find third-way place where Apache can live freely but also remain close enough to help white friends when needed?" The idea that emerged from that discussion was revolutionary. The creation of a semi-autonomous Apache settlement on land purchased legally from the territorial government, with Ben serving as the official white sponsor and medical supervisor. It would be neither a reservation nor an illegal encampment, but something entirely new, a self-governing Apache community operating under territorial law. The proposal required complex negotiations with territorial officials, military commanders, and Apache leaders from multiple bands. Ben found himself serving as more than just a doctor. He was now a diplomatic intermediary, legal advocate, and political organizer, using his reputation and professional standing to open doors that would have remained closed to Apache representatives. The breakthrough came when Naalnish agreed to serve as the spiritual and political leader of the new settlement, lending his enormous prestige within Apache society to the experimental community. Other Apache bands, impressed by the success of the Mesa Blanca cooperation, began sending representatives to explore the possibility of joining the new settlement. But the most crucial support came from an unexpected source: the territorial governor himself, who recognized that the Mesa Blanca experiment represented a potential model for resolving Apache conflicts throughout the Southwest. Instead of expensive military campaigns and the ongoing costs of maintaining reservations, the new settlement offered the possibility of peaceful coexistence that could benefit everyone involved. "Dr. Wade," Governor Marsh said during their final meeting in the territorial capital, "you've created something that most people thought was impossible, a working partnership between Apache and white communities. If this experiment succeeds, it could change the entire nature of Indian policy in this territory." The formal agreement establishing the new settlement was signed on a warm June morning, with representatives from both communities present to witness the historic moment. Ben stood beside Naalnish as they put their signatures to the document that would create the first legally recognized autonomous Apache community in territorial history. But even as they celebrated this diplomatic triumph, Ben knew that the real test was just beginning. The new settlement, which Naalnish named Biko Ilba, meaning where hearts come together in Apache, was established in a valley 20 miles from Mesa Blanca, chosen for its abundant water, natural defenses, and proximity to both white settlements and traditional Apache territories. But creating a legal framework was far easier than building a functioning community that could satisfy the needs of both Apache families and territorial authorities. Ben found himself spending more time at Biko Ilba than in Mesa Blanca, serving not just as the settlement's medical officer but as its primary liaison with the territorial government. Every aspect of the community's development was scrutinized by officials looking for evidence that the experiment was either failing or succeeding beyond expectations. The Apache proved remarkably adaptable to the hybrid lifestyle that the settlement required. They maintained their traditional social structures and cultural practices, while also developing the agricultural, educational, and economic systems that territorial law required for recognized communities. Children learned both Apache traditions and English literacy, while adults balanced traditional crafts with market-oriented production of goods that could be sold to white settlements. But it was the medical collaboration that continued to produce the most remarkable results. Ben's integration of traditional Apache healing practices with modern medicine was attracting attention from physicians throughout the Southwest, many of whom traveled to Biko Ilba to observe and learn from the innovative treatment methods being developed there. What you've accomplished here challenges everything we thought we knew about primitive medicine, Dr. Harrison from the Territorial Medical College said during one of his visits. Some of these traditional remedies are more effective than anything in our pharmacies. The success of the medical program led to the establishment of what was essentially the first integrated medical school in the American West, where both Apache healers and white physicians could study each other's methods and develop new approaches to frontier medicine. Students came from as far away as California and Texas to participate in the unique educational program, but the settlement's growing reputation also attracted unwelcome attention. Hostile Apache bands saw Biko Ilba as a betrayal of traditional ways, while some white settlers viewed it as a dangerous precedent that gave Apache too much autonomy and legal protection. The delicate balance between cooperation and independence that made the settlement possible also made it a target for extremists on both sides. The first serious threat came from a group of Apache warriors led by a war chief named Geronimo, who viewed the settlement as evidence that Naalnish and his followers had been corrupted by white influence. A delegation of hostile warriors arrived at Biko Ilba, demanding that the residents abandon their cooperation with whites and join traditional Apache resistance movements. "You have forgotten what it means to be Apache," Geronimo declared during a tense confrontation with Naalnish in the settlement's council circle. "You live like white men, take white man's medicine, send your children to learn white man's ways. Where is your pride? Where is your honor?" Naalnish's response demonstrated the wisdom that had made him a respected leader among both Apache and white communities. "Apache pride comes from taking care of our people, protecting our children, ensuring that Apache culture survives," the old medicine man replied. "What we do here serves all those goals. We are not becoming white men, we are learning to live in white man's world without losing our souls." The debate that followed lasted for 3 days, with the entire settlement gathering to hear arguments from both sides about the proper path for Apache people in a changing world. Ben, as one of the few whites present, remained silent throughout most of the discussions, recognizing that this was ultimately a decision that Apache people had to make for themselves. The resolution came when several Apache families from other bands arrived seeking admission to the settlement, bringing with them stories of successful hunting seasons, profitable trade relationships, and children who were learning to read and write while maintaining their cultural traditions. The evidence of the settlement's success spoke louder than any argument. Geronimo departed without violence, but his parting words carried an ominous warning. White man's friendship will not last. When times become hard, when white men need Apache land for themselves, they will break their promises as they always have. Then you will remember my words and wish you had listened. Ben couldn't entirely dismiss the warning, knowing as he did the history of broken treaties and failed promises that had characterized white-Indian relations throughout the frontier period. But he also knew that the alternative, continued warfare and mutual destruction, offered no hope for either people. As autumn approached, bringing the second anniversary of the typhus outbreak that had started it all, Ben reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since that day when he'd first ridden into Mesa Blanca. The second winter at Biko Ilba proved to be a crucial test of the settlement's viability, as a combination of harsh weather and external pressures threatened to destroy everything that had been built. A severe drought the previous summer had reduced crop yields throughout the territory, while increased Apache raids by hostile bands had created a climate of fear and suspicion that affected even peaceful communities. The crisis deepened when territorial officials, facing pressure from Washington to reduce costs and demonstrate progress on the Indian problem, began questioning whether the special legal status granted to Biko Ilba was still justified. A new territorial administrator, Colonel Bradshaw, arrived with orders to evaluate all Apache settlements and recommend which should be closed or consolidated with existing reservations. "Dr. Wade," Bradshaw announced during his inspection visit, "I've reviewed the files on this settlement, and I have serious concerns about its long-term viability. The territorial government has invested considerable resources in this experiment, and the results are questionable." Ben felt his jaw tighten as he looked at the starched uniform and officious bearing of a man who clearly had little understanding of what had been accomplished at Biko Ilba. "Colonel, perhaps you'd like to see some of those results firsthand before making your evaluation." What followed was the most comprehensive tour Ben had ever given of the settlement's achievements. Bradshaw was shown the medical clinic where Apache and white physicians worked side by side, the school where children learned in both English and Apache, the workshops where traditional crafts were being adapted for commercial production, and the farms where innovative agricultural techniques were producing higher yields than most white settlements achieved. But perhaps most impressive was the settlement's response to the ongoing crisis of Apache raids throughout the territory. Rather than simply defending themselves, the people of Biko Ilba had become active mediators, using their connections with both communities to prevent conflicts and facilitate peaceful resolutions when violence did occur. In the past year alone, Ben explained as they visited the settlement's communication center, our people have prevented 6 potential conflicts between Apache bands and white settlements, mediated 2 treaty disputes, and provided intelligence that helped the military track down 3 groups of genuinely hostile raiders. The evidence was impressive, but Bradshaw remained skeptical. All of this assumes that cooperation will continue indefinitely. What happens when economic pressures or political changes make this arrangement less attractive to one side or the other? It was a legitimate concern, and one that Ben had been grappling with as he watched tensions rise throughout the territory. The success of Biko Ilba depended on goodwill from both Apache and white communities, and that goodwill was being strained by events beyond anyone's control. The answer came from an unexpected source. As Bradshaw's inspection continued, word arrived that a cholera outbreak had struck the town of Silver City, nearly 100 miles to the south. The territorial government was desperately seeking medical assistance, but most physicians were reluctant to risk exposure to the deadly disease. "We'll go," Naalnish announced when the request for help was presented to the settlement's council. "Apache healers know cholera, know how to treat it without becoming sick ourselves. This is opportunity to show territorial government that Biko Ilba serves all people, not just Apache." The medical mission that followed became legendary throughout the Southwest. Ben led a team of 6 Apache healers and 2 white physicians to Silver City, where they worked around the clock for 3 weeks to contain the cholera outbreak and treat its victims. Their combination of modern medical techniques and traditional Apache healing methods proved remarkably effective, with a survival rate far higher than anything achieved in previous cholera epidemics. More importantly, the mission demonstrated the practical value of the Biko Ilba model in terms that even skeptical territorial officials couldn't ignore. The settlement had responded to a regional crisis with speed, expertise, and effectiveness that exceeded anything the territorial government could have mobilized on its own. "Dr. Wade," Colonel Bradshaw said as the medical team prepared to return to Biko Ilba, "I came here prepared to recommend that this settlement be closed as an expensive failure. Instead, I'm going to recommend that it be expanded as a model for Apache policy throughout the territory." The colonel's report, submitted to territorial headquarters and eventually forwarded to Washington, would become one of the key documents in the development of new federal Indian policies. But for Ben and the people of Biko Ilba, the most important result was the security that came with official recognition of their success. As they rode back to their valley home, Ben reflected on how the boy who had dreamed of becoming a doctor to help people had somehow become the architect of a new way for different peoples to live together in peace and mutual respect. The success of the Silver City mission marked a turning point for Biko Ilba, transforming it from an experimental settlement under constant scrutiny to a recognized and valued part of the territorial government's approach to Apache relations. But with recognition came new responsibilities and new challenges that tested the community's ability to maintain its unique character while serving broader regional needs. The first major change came in the form of official designation as a territorial Indian medical center, with federal funding to expand the clinic and training programs that had proven so successful. The designation brought resources and legitimacy, but it also brought oversight and bureaucratic requirements that sometimes conflicted with traditional Apache decision-making processes. "We must be careful not to lose our souls while gaining white man's approval," Naalnish warned during one of the council meetings that had become a regular part of settlement governance. "Success can be as dangerous as failure if it changes who we are." Ben found himself walking an increasingly difficult tightrope between the federal bureaucracy that now provided much of the settlement's funding and the Apache traditions that made the community unique. Every month brought new regulations, reporting requirements, and inspections from officials who understood bureaucratic procedures but had little appreciation for the delicate cultural balance that made Biko Ilba successful. The challenge was compounded by the settlement's growing reputation, which attracted visitors from throughout the United States and even from European countries interested in studying what was being called the American Indian integration model. Anthropologists, government officials, religious leaders, and journalists arrived in a steady stream, all eager to document and analyze the experiment for their own purposes. "Sometimes I feel like we're animals in a zoo," Taza complained as they prepared for yet another delegation of visitors from Washington. The young Apache had become the settlement's primary interpreter and cultural liaison, but the constant pressure of representing his people to outsiders was taking its toll. "The price of success," Ben replied sympathetically. "But remember, every person who visits here and sees what we've accomplished goes back to their own community with new ideas about what's possible between Apache and white people." The most significant test of the settlement's principles came when the territorial government requested that Biko Ilba serve as a training center for Apache scouts, who would work with the military to track down hostile raiders. The proposal made sense from a practical standpoint. The settlement's residents had extensive knowledge of Apache customs and territory that could be invaluable in military operations, but it also threatened to transform the peaceful community into an arm of the military establishment that many Apache viewed with deep suspicion and hostility. The debate that followed was the most intense in the settlement's history, touching on fundamental questions about loyalty, identity, and the proper relationship between Apache people and the United States government. "If we help soldiers fight other Apache, what does that make us?" asked one of the traditionalist elders during the council discussions. "Are we still Apache, or have we become something else?" Naalnish's response reflected the wisdom that had guided the settlement through previous crises. "Apache people have always been survivors," he said. "We survive by adapting to changing conditions while keeping our hearts true to Apache values. Helping to stop raids that hurt innocent people, Apache or white, serves Apache values. But helping soldiers who want to destroy all Apache does not." The compromise that emerged from weeks of discussion established clear guidelines for any military cooperation. Biko Ilba would provide scouts and intelligence only for operations targeting Apache bands that had committed crimes against civilians, and only under the direct supervision of settlement leaders, who could ensure that military actions remained focused and proportionate. The first test of these guidelines came sooner than expected, when a renegade Apache band led by a war chief named Victorio began a campaign of raids that targeted both white settlements and peaceful Apache communities. The raiders' attacks on innocent families, including Apache families that had refused to join their campaign, created a crisis that demanded response from all responsible members of the region. Ben found himself in the unprecedented position of coordinating between Apache scouts from Biko Ilba and military commanders who had previously viewed all Apache as enemies. The collaboration that developed was tense and difficult, requiring constant negotiation and compromise, but it proved remarkably effective in tracking down the raiders and ending their campaign of violence. The success of the joint operation established Biko Ilba's reputation as more than just an experimental community. It was now recognized as a crucial partner in maintaining peace and stability throughout the territorial region. But with that recognition came pressures that would ultimately test the settlement's survival. By its 5th year, Biko Ilba had become far more than anyone had originally envisioned. It was simultaneously a thriving Apache community, a pioneering medical center, a diplomatic headquarters for Indian-white relations, and a symbol of what was possible when different peoples chose cooperation over conflict. But the very success that had made the settlement famous was also creating stresses that threatened to tear it apart. The most serious challenge came from within the Apache community itself. As word of Biko Ilba's prosperity spread throughout Apache territory, it attracted not only peaceful families seeking a better life, but also individuals whose motives were less pure. Some newcomers saw the settlement as an opportunity for personal advancement rather than genuine cultural bridge building, while others brought with them old grievances and tribal conflicts that threatened the harmony that had made the community successful. The crisis peaked when a faction of recent arrivals, led by an ambitious young warrior named Delche, began advocating for more aggressive tactics in dealing with territorial authorities. They argued that the settlement had become too dependent on white approval and should assert greater independence, even if it meant risking the legal protections that Biko Ilba enjoyed. "We bow too low to white officials," Delche declared during a heated council meeting. "We ask permission for things that should be Apache rights. We have become like trained dogs, performing tricks for white man's approval." The criticism stung because it contained elements of truth. The settlement's success had indeed required careful negotiation and compromise with territorial authorities, and some traditional Apache practices had been modified or abandoned to maintain peaceful relations with the government. The question was whether those sacrifices had been worth the benefits they'd produced. Ben found himself in the uncomfortable position of defending the settlement's policies against criticism from people whose lives had been improved by those very policies. As the only white member of the council, his words carried weight, but they also made him a target for those who saw any white influence as inherently corrupting. Delche speaks of pride and independence, Ben said during one particularly tense meeting. But I've seen what happens when pride becomes more important than survival. I've treated the wounded from battles that served no purpose except to satisfy someone's sense of honor. The question isn't whether we've compromised, the question is whether our compromises have served our people's interests. The debate that followed was painful but necessary, forcing the community to confront fundamental questions about its identity and future direction. Some families chose to leave, seeking either the traditional lifestyle of the reservations or the complete assimilation offered by white society. But the majority chose to stay, reaffirming their commitment to the difficult but rewarding path of cultural bridge building. The resolution of the internal crisis strengthened the settlement's foundations, but it also attracted the attention of federal officials who were developing new policies for Indian affairs throughout the American West. A delegation from Washington arrived in late summer with a proposal that would transform Biko Ilba from a unique local experiment into the model for a new national approach to Indian policy. Dr. Wade, announced Commissioner of Indian Affairs John Wesley Powell during his visit, the President has asked me to discuss the possibility of expanding the Biko Ilba model to other regions where Indian-white conflicts remain unresolved. We're prepared to offer significant federal support for such an expansion. The offer was both flattering and terrifying. Federal support would provide resources that could transform the Southwest, creating a network of integrated communities that could serve as bridges between Indian and white societies. But it would also mean the end of Biko Ilba's unique character, transforming it from a grassroots experiment into a government program with all the bureaucratic constraints that such status implied. What exactly are you proposing? Ben asked carefully. A series of settlements modeled on your success here, each serving as a regional center for Indian-white cooperation. You would serve as the director of the entire program, with authority to establish policy and oversee operations throughout the territorial region. The position offered power and influence that Ben had never sought, but it also represented an opportunity to spread the lessons learned at Biko Ilba to other communities struggling with similar challenges. After consulting with Naalnish and the Settlement Council, Ben accepted the position with the understanding that Biko Ilba would remain autonomous while serving as the headquarters for the broader program. The expansion that followed was both ambitious and challenging. Over the next 3 years, 7 additional settlements were established throughout Arizona and New Mexico territories, each adapted to local conditions and tribal customs, but following the basic principles that had made Biko Ilba successful. Ben found himself traveling constantly between communities, troubleshooting problems, mediating conflicts, and refining the techniques that made integration possible. But it was the unexpected crisis that struck during the program's 3rd year that truly tested the strength of what they had built. The crisis began with what appeared to be routine correspondence, a letter from the Bureau of Indian Affairs announcing a change in federal policy that would require all Indian communities to conform to standardized regulations regarding education, governance, and economic development. The new rules, designed to promote efficient administration of Indian affairs, would eliminate many of the cultural accommodations that had made the integrated settlements successful. They want to turn us into just another government program, Taza said bitterly as he translated the federal directive for the Biko Ilba Council. Now a respected leader in his own right, Taza had become Ben's closest collaborator in managing the expanded network of settlements. The implications of the new regulations were staggering. Traditional Apache governance structures would be replaced by federally appointed administrators. Native languages would be prohibited in schools. Religious and cultural practices would be subject to federal approval. In essence, the very elements that had made the settlements attractive to Apache families would be eliminated in favor of bureaucratic uniformity. This is what Geronimo warned us about, Naalnish said sadly. The old medicine man, now in his 70s but still sharp and influential, had lived to see his warnings about broken promises come true. White man's friendship lasts only as long as it serves white man's interests. Ben felt the weight of responsibility crushing down on him as he realized that his success in promoting the settlement model had inadvertently provided the federal government with a mechanism for destroying the very communities he'd sought to protect. The integrated settlements, which had been created to preserve Apache culture while adapting to modern realities, were now being transformed into instruments of cultural destruction. The choice facing the settlements was stark. comply with the new regulations and lose their essential character, or resist and face federal intervention that could destroy them entirely. But Ben and his Apache partners had learned over the years that sometimes the most effective form of resistance was to change the terms of the debate entirely. What if we don't fight the regulations directly? Ben suggested during an emergency meeting of leaders from all 8 settlements. What if we comply with the letter of the law, while preserving the spirit of what we've built? The strategy that emerged from weeks of planning was both audacious and legally sound. Rather than resisting federal oversight, the settlements would embrace it but on their own terms. They would demonstrate that the new regulations could be implemented in ways that actually strengthened rather than weakened their communities, proving that cultural preservation and federal compliance weren't mutually exclusive. The campaign that followed was conducted simultaneously in Washington meeting rooms and settlement council circles throughout the Southwest. Ben testified before congressional committees about the practical benefits of cultural integration, while Apache leaders demonstrated that traditional governance structures could operate effectively within federal frameworks. Most importantly, the settlements themselves became living proof that federal Indian policy could serve both government efficiency and tribal autonomy. The breakthrough came when President Harrison himself visited Biko Ilba during a tour of the Southwest, accompanied by a delegation of congressmen and federal officials. What they saw challenged every assumption about Indian capabilities and federal Indian policy. Dr. Wade, the president said as he toured the settlement's medical facilities, "What you've accomplished here suggests that our approach to Indian affairs has been fundamentally flawed. These people aren't problems to be managed, they're assets to be developed." The presidential visit resulted in a complete reversal of federal policy. The standardization regulations were withdrawn, and new guidelines were issued that encouraged, rather than discouraged, the kind of cultural adaptation that had made the settlement successful. Ben was appointed as the first director of Integrated Indian Affairs, with authority to develop policy for the entire western United States. But perhaps the most significant change was personal rather than political. At the age of 57, Ben had achieved recognition and influence that few frontier doctors could have imagined. He had helped create a new model for race relations that was being studied and copied throughout the world. He had saved countless lives, prevented numerous conflicts, and proven that cooperation between different peoples was not only possible, but profitable for everyone involved. As he stood on the hill overlooking Biko Ilba during the settlement's 10th anniversary celebration, watching Apache and white children playing together while their parents worked side by side on community projects, Ben reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought him to this moment. It had begun with a simple medical emergency, a typhus outbreak, that threatened a small frontier community. It had evolved into something far greater, proof that the American experiment in democracy and freedom could include all peoples, regardless of race or culture. Naalnish, now truly elderly but still vital and wise, joined Ben on the hill as the celebration continued below them. "White doctor," the old medicine man said with a smile, "you have given Apache people something more valuable than medicine. You have given us hope that our children can live in both worlds without losing their souls. And you've given me something I never expected to find," Ben replied. "A family, a purpose, and the knowledge that healing isn't just about treating individual patients, it's about healing the wounds between peoples." 20 years later, when Dr. Benjamin Wade died peacefully at the age of 77, representatives from 40 different tribes attended his funeral, along with federal officials, territorial governors, and physicians from throughout the United States. He was buried on the hill overlooking Biko Ilba, under a headstone that bore inscriptions in both English and Apache. But perhaps his greatest monument was the network of integrated communities that stretched throughout the American West, places where the dream of genuine equality and mutual respect had become reality. The federal Indian policy that emerged from his work would serve as the foundation for Native American rights for generations to come, proving that one doctor's commitment to healing could indeed heal the wounds of an entire nation. The settlement that had begun as a response to a medical emergency had become a beacon of hope for the future, demonstrating that in America, at its best, there was room for all peoples to prosper while maintaining their unique contributions to the great experiment in human freedom and dignity. Today, visitors to the Biko Ilba historical site can see reconstructions of the original settlement, along with a museum that tells the story of Dr. Benjamin Wade and the Apache leaders who chose cooperation over conflict. The site is maintained jointly by the federal government and the Apache Nation, a living symbol of the partnership that proved that healing and hope could triumph over hatred and fear. On the memorial wall at the entrance to the museum, words in both English and Apache capture the essence of what was accomplished in that hidden valley where hearts truly came together. Here different peoples learned that their strength lay not in their separateness, but in their willingness to share the best of their traditions while building something new and better together.